Shabbat Shalom Havarim, James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. And when I started getting ready to make this video, I had so much material that was really significant material demonstrating that the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew is directly related within the Hebrew tradition to the original Hebrew text of Matthew. Unfortunately, there was so much of it, it would have been a 5 or 6 hour video if I included everything. So I'm including some of the basic foundational material in this video, and then we will be making future videos, not necessarily in succession. Who knows, maybe I'll make a playlist out of it, about the DuTillet Hebrew Matthew with even more information that I'm presenting today in this video. But I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much information, or with a video that just went on for hours. So before I get started, I want to ask everybody to please donate to support these videos. Our rent is due in 2 days, and right now we only have about $100 to our name. So we need you guys to please chip in if you possibly can to donate to support this work. For those that don't know, my wife is disabled, chronically ill, and suffers from chronic pain, and I stay home as her caregiver. So we need your help to help us pay the rent and have food, clothing, and shelter. And that makes it then possible for me to continue making videos like this, because if we're homeless and don't have food, clothing, and shelter, it makes it rather difficult for me to put this kind of material together. All right, so my connection to the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew, or the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, goes all the way back to the 1980s. Not long after I became a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah, I started doing research looking for ancient Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts of New Testament books. And one of those that I came across, information that I came across in my research, was that there was a manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France, Hebrew manuscript number 132, that was a Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. Now, before I continue going, 2 things. One, I asked you to please donate to support this work, but I didn't tell you how. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description, or by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Also, like we frequently do, we have handouts that you can follow along with in this video, and you can print that out or get those handouts by clicking on the handouts link in the video description, where there's a PDF file that you can either print out or look at on your on a secondary screen or whatever while you're following along in this study. Also, I need to ask everybody to please like this video. I need to ask you to please subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell so that you can get updates or get notifications when new videos come out. Also, let us know what you think in the comments section of the videos, and participate in the discussions in the comments section. All of these things are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to determine which videos to recommend to new viewers, and we want to get recommended to new viewers. Likewise, also please share these videos on social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., with your friends. That also gets us out in front of new viewers. Okay, so as I was saying, my own connection to the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew goes back to the 1980s. And what is the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew? The first page of our handouts. The DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew is taken from a Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, which was confiscated from Jews in Rome in 1553. On August 12th, 1553, at the petition of Pietro, Cardinal Carafa, the Inquisitor General, Pope Julius III signed a decree banning the Talmud in Rome. The decree was executed on September 9th, Rosh Hashanah, and anything that looked like a Talmud, that is, anything that was written in Hebrew letters, was confiscated as Jewish homes and synagogues were ransacked and ravished. There was a visiting bishop from France named Jean DuTillet, who knew Hebrew, at least enough Hebrew, to recognize that there was, he was visiting Rome, and he recognized a Hebrew manuscript of Matthew among other Hebrew manuscripts heading for the fires. And he acquired the manuscript and he returned to France, depositing it in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it is still there to this very day as Hebrew manuscript number 132. I learned of this Hebrew manuscript number 132 that was confiscated from Jews in Italy in 1553, or in Rome particularly in 1553, and brought back to Paris, France. And so I, at that time, in the late 80s, was studying under Rabbi Moyal. Rabbi Moyal was Armand Danny Moyal. He was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi from Israel who had come to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah from studying the Talmud, the Midrashim, the Zohar, etc. And he had been born in Morocco and was in an orphanage in French Morocco, and had been in his very early youth. And he and his orphanage were evacuated to Israel, or moved to Israel, to be raised up and in Israel. And so he studied. This orphanage was led by rabbis, and he was brought up to be a rabbi. And so he knew French, because it was French Morocco, Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, all fluently. And he knew a little bit of English, not much, just a little bit. And I knew a little bit of Hebrew. So between the Hebrew and the English, we managed to communicate. And the reason I bring Rabbi Moyal up is he was instrumental in helping me to obtain a microfilm of this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France. Rabbi Moyal, being fluent in French, using three-way calling, I called the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France. He got me past the receptionist and to the curator of Hebrew manuscripts, who was a man named Mr. Gavel. And Mr. Gavel was a Oxford educated, and he was fluent in English, fortunately. And so he was very helpful in helping me find out how to order the microfilm of this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France. This was not easy. This was in the 80s, and it wasn't the internet world that we live in today. And so in order to get this manuscript, I had to buy it in French francs. And so I had to go to a special bank and get out buy an international draft I think it was like $5 worth of French francs, or 5 French. It was a very small amount relatively. But in those days, an international draft was usually something that big businesses would use to pay for, you know, a tanker, an oil tanker full of oil coming in from overseas, something of that nature. And so the international draft cost me $50 for, you know, so it's like getting a money order for a $5 money order and paying $50 for the $5 money order. Nonetheless, I did it, of course, because it was very worth it. I wanted the manuscript, and so the manuscript was sent to me on a ship that took several months to get here, and I still have the box here that was sent to me, and it arrived in 1990. By the time I actually got it, here's the actual microfilm. And what I discovered then when I got it was that the microfilm was metric. So my original plan, didn't then, nor have I ever had a microfilm reader. My original plan was go to my library and feed it into the microfilm reader and make copies of the pages that I want, because my library was set up so I could push a button that would make a printout of a page. And so I was planning to do that. But then I discovered that the microfilm was metric and wouldn't properly fit into or work properly with an American microfilm reader. So I had to find a specialty shop in Dallas, Texas, and I managed to find a specialty shop that could read metric microfilm and would then print out the microfilm, make printouts of all the pages of the microfilm. And I still have that here in my library. You can see it's tattered and old because I've had it for several decades now. About 33 years. And then so that's how I acquired this Hebrew text of Matthew. Now, I later found out that there was a printed edition, not only in 1553, which I've since obtained, but in the 1800s, there was a printed edition published by Adolf Herbst in German, but it was Hebrew. Unfortunately, Adolf Herbst mistakenly believed that the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript was a manuscript of the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew. And they have some parallels. They have some commonalities. They are definitely directly related in Hebrew to one another, but they are also very definitely different texts. And we'll talk about that more in the future when we do a video on the Shem Tov text. I also discovered that there was a very similar Hebrew text of Matthew called the Münster Hebrew text that was published by Sebastian Münster a few years earlier in 1537, and I went to some great trouble to get copies of the entire text of Münster's 1537 edition. I later found out that one of Münster's students published another edition in 1551, and I tracked that down as well. And that's this edition here, and got photostatic copies of every page of that edition. And the reason that edition is so important is because This edition has marginal notes in which Münster's student published alternate readings from other Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew that were apparently available to him at that time. And so we have all of these witnesses to this general Hebrew text of Matthew. Now, up until this time, the late 80s and 1990, when I actually got the microfilm, March of 1990, but it was 1989 sometime when I originally ordered the microfilm, and maybe even earlier than that. It was quite a process. I know at least goes back to 1988, I believe, when I made the phone call to Paris. Anyway, there are only a couple of scholars that really had paid much attention to this Hebrew version of Matthew at the time. One was Hugh Schoenfield, and he published a book, An Old Hebrew Text of St. Matthew's Gospel, in 1927. And he said certain linguistic proofs seem to show, and this is on page 17 of his book, certain linguistic proofs seem to show that the Hebrew text underlies the Greek, and that certain renderings in the Greek may be due to a misread Hebrew original. Now, the other scholar that had done any work on this was George Howard, whom later the two of us became friends and corresponded back and forth. In fact, I actually sent him copies of the Hebrew manuscript of DuTillet that I had obtained from Paris, France. He didn't have it. He sent me, in return, photocopies of Adolf Herbst's printed edition. Okay, initially in his 1986 article that he published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, and this is all this information where you can find it and everything is in your handouts. So initially Howard concluded that the DuTillet text was a translation from Greek, but later he concluded in a later 1986 article that it was, quote, the DuTillet version is, quote, a revision of an earlier Hebrew Matthew, which he determined was related to the Shem Tov Hebrew version. And if you know anything about George Howard and the Shem Tov Hebrew version, he absolutely believed that the Shem Tov Hebrew version descended from the original Hebrew of Matthew. I'm not saying that he was completely wrong there. I will say, and will demonstrate this in a future video, that the Shem Tov text is far more corrupt, and I believe that the DuTillet text, even though it's related to Shem Tov distantly, that it is closer to the original Hebrew of Matthew than the Shem Tov text. And one of the reasons, well, there's several reasons. Some of them are things that we're going to look at here, and some of the things that differentiate the two we'll talk about later when we talk about the Shem Tov text. Okay, so let's turn to the next page of our handout. It's titled The Missing Name. So there's a well-known mistake in the Greek text of the genealogy of Yeshua. While the text itself claims to give 3 lists of 14 names, according to Matthew chapter 1, verse 17, the Greek text only has 13 names in the last list. Okay, and so I actually in the handout listed these out. The names from the first 14 names are from Abraham to David, and we listed them all out. The next 14 names are from David to the carrying away to Babylon, going from Solomon actually to Manasseh, and to Jechonias. And then there are only 13 names in the final list from Salatiel to Yeshua or Jesus. There's only 13 names, and we listed them out here for you. Each of these 3 lists of names. However, in the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew, where we have the name, the third name in the list of 13 names, it's is Aviud. and there's an additional name in the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew that's Avner. Okay, and then Aviud. We'll look at that in more detail in a few minutes because it's going to tie in to a scribal error in the book, in the Old Syriac Aramaic version of Matthew. All right, let's now turn to our next handout titled The Definite Article. So I will hear from people that the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew has been proven to be a translation from Greek. And I've heard, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that. And when somebody says that, it becomes clear to me that they haven't studied the topic at all. And the reason is that nobody who's seriously studied it believes the DuTillet Hebrew text of Matthew is a translation from Greek. At best, they might argue that it was a translation from Latin, but not from Greek. So anybody that starts talking to you about it being a translation from Greek doesn't know what they're talking about. One of the reasons that we know that it can't be a translation from Greek is that Hebrew has a definite article. Just like in English, the definite article is the. Okay? Hebrew has a definite article, ha. Greek has a definite article. Okay? But Aramaic does not have a definite article, or at least it has a very weak definite article. And Latin also has no definite article. Okay, so when we compare the Hebrew text of Matthew in DuTillet with the Greek text of Matthew, we find that the definite articles don't match up. In Matthew 3:7, for example, okay, let's look at 3 examples, this is in your handouts, where the Hebrew has no definite articles, but the Greek does have them. Many of the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's Matthew 3:7. Matthew 6:32, the Gentiles. Again, there's a definite article in the Greek, but not in the Hebrew there. And in Matthew chapter 14, verse 15, the villages. There's a definite article in the Greek, but not in the Hebrew of the DuTillet text. Also, we have examples where the Hebrew has a definite article and the Greek doesn't. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 8, the fruit worthy. The fruit has a definite article in the Hebrew, but not in the Greek. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, the net. Again, there's a definite article in the Hebrew, but not in the Greek. And in Matthew chapter 7, verse 9, the stone. There's a definite article there in the Hebrew, but not in the Greek. So there must be a language, regardless of which direction the translation is going, there must be a language in between the Hebrew and Greek text, between the DuTillet Hebrew text and the Greek text. There must be some language that it passed in between the two that didn't have a definite article or had a very weak definite article. For all practical purposes, the Syriac Aramaic doesn't have a definite article. And so there either had to be a Aramaic or a Latin version in between the two. So if somebody's going to try and argue that the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew isn't directly related to a Hebrew version, a Hebrew original of Matthew, then they're going to need to argue that it was translated into Latin or translated from Latin, that the Greek was translated to Latin and the Latin was translated to the Hebrew. Or I would argue that the Hebrew of the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew was translated into Aramaic, as we see in the Old Syriac and Peshitta Aramaic text, and then that Aramaic text was translated into Greek. Now, the reason that I think that that's more likely than the other is because the DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew has far more agreement with the Old Syriac Aramaic text of Matthew than with the Latin Vulgate Aramaic text of Matthew. All right, let's turn now to our next handout, moving on along. DuTillet and the Old Syriac. This is very, very important. The DuTillet, let's start with the fact that Hebrew and Aramaic are very similar languages, okay? They're completely alien to and different from Greek and Latin, etc. Hebrew and Aramaic are cognate languages. They are very similar. They both use the same 22-letter Hebrew alphabet. They are similar as, say, Spanish and Portuguese. Okay. They both use the same 22-letter Hebrew letters. And even though the Syriac is sometimes written with a cursive Syriac script, it's still the same 22 letters. They use many of the same three-letter roots, the same verbal root system. So they have very similar vocabulary, and they have very similar grammar. So they're very similar languages. And they both read right to left, whereas Greek and Latin read left to right. Okay, so let's look at, here's the very interesting thing. Let's talk about the Old Syriac version. We'll do a whole video in the future on the Old Syriac version of the four Gospels. I think the important thing to realize about the Old Syriac version is that it was virtually lost from the 4th century, since the 4th or 5th centuries. We did find recently 1/10th century page from the Old Syriac, but by and large the Old Syriac fell out of use as it was replaced by the Peshitta, which was, by the way, and we'll do a whole video on this in the future, a revision of the Old Syriac towards greater agreement with the Byzantine type of Greek text. So the idea that a Hebrew text of Matthew from the Middle Ages, from the 1500s even, would have significant agreement with a Syriac Aramaic manuscript from the 4th century is extremely significant. There should be no reason for this unless they are part of a original Hebrew and Aramaic tradition. They both are. And when you really, frankly, when you examine them, you see a great deal of the same sentence structure. And to me, it really looks like you can see that the Aramaic of the Old Syriac reads like a translation, an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text found in DuTillet. So there are some astounding parallels between the two. We're just going to look at a few at the beginning of Matthew. We don't have time, anywhere near enough time to look at all of them. So in Matthew chapter 1, verse 13, I pointed out already that the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew contains the missing name Avner, which has been lost from the Greek text. It's also lost from the Aramaic, but in a little bit unique way. The DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew contains the missing name Avner, which is sometimes spelled in Hebrew Avnir, okay, with a yud resh, which occurs between Avihud and Eliakim in the DuTillet Hebrew text of Matthew 1:13. By the way, what's really interesting is the DuTillet text was found in 1553, but in 1551, Münster's student published the reprint of the Münster text, which does not have the missing name in it, while DuTillet does. However, in the margin, you can see here, in the margin, for those that can read Hebrew, he has Avner. So the Münster's student was privy to another manuscript, not DuTillet, but a manuscript that has since been lost, that had Avner in that spot as well. What's interesting is that it's very common for Dalet and Resh, which look very much alike in Hebrew and in Syriac, to get traded back and forth as a scribal error, for a scribe to miscopy a Dalet as a Resh or a Resh as a Dalet. Now, D and R don't look anything alike in English, but in Aramaic and in Hebrew, they absolutely look very similar, and the Resh is rounded and the Dalet is kind of squared off and has even sometimes a slight overlap. You can see this in the handouts, by the way. So the interesting thing is that the Old Syriac Aramaic version of Matthew has, instead of Aviud, as we see, for example, in the Greek, it has Aviur with a resh there. And it's very interesting that appears right exactly where where we have Avner. So instead of having Avihud, Avner, and then Avner, the Old Syriac has Aviur. Interesting. Very interesting. So let's look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 20. Miriam's conception. And here the Greek has, this is it here in your handouts, the Greek has, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. But the DuTillet Hebrew text says, for that which will be born of her is from the Ruach HaKodesh, for from the Ruach HaKodesh she has conceived. And even if you can't read the Hebrew, in the handout I put the Hebrew here, and I put the words for will be born and she has conceived in red, so they stand out. What's very interesting is that the Old Syriac, Curetonian manuscript, there's two manuscripts of the Old Syriac, has, for that which is born of her, from the Ruach HaKodesh is conceived. No other version of Matthew has born of her, has born, and then ends with conceived. Only the 4th century Aramaic Old Syriac text and the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript Matthew that was confiscated from Jews in 1553. Okay, some more of these are comparatively incidental. For example, in Matthew 2:23, in the Hebrew, Shem Tov, DuTillet, and Munster, all three. In the Aramaic of the Old Syriac, the word for prophet, when it says spoken by the prophet, is singular, while it's plural in both the Greek and the Latin Vulgate. Then Matthew chapter 3, verse 5, the Greek says, then went out to him Jerusalem, as does the Latin Vulgate and the Peshitta. However, the Old Syriac, DuTillet, and Shem Tov all have from Jerusalem. Went out to him from Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 3, verse 15, where it says, and immersed him. Only DuTillet, Shem Tov, and the Old Syriac have, and he immersed him, at the end of verse 15. This does not appear in the Greek, the Latin Vulgate, or the Peshitta. Matthew chapter 3, verse 16, DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew says, or does not say, like a dove, but instead says, in the likeness of a dove, in agreement with the Old Syriac. And this also, by the way, is in agreement with the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which we did a previous video on several months ago. All right. Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, in the Greek, the Latin Vulgate, and even the Peshitta, Matthew 4:4 opens with, and he answered and said to him. However, the DuTillet Hebrew Matthew and the Old Syriac have Yeshua answered and said. Matthew chapter 5, verse 34. Now this one, pay close attention to. This is very, very significant. Some of these that we've looked at up to this point were interesting but rather incidental. But here we have Matthew chapter 5:34. In this passage we see a very unique grammatical nuance in the Hebrew text of DuTillet that's found elsewhere only in the Old Syriac. Okay, it's actually a grammatical error. The DuTillet has, for it is Elohim's throne, theirs. Now, in Hebrew, the way we say these things sometimes, we'll say we'll say for throne of Elohim, and then we'll have a pronoun there. And the pronoun is modifying the whole thing so it says, for it is Elohim's throne, theirs. We wouldn't say it that way in English. And we wouldn't say that way in English anyway, because we'd say, for it is Elohim's throne, his. We wouldn't say, for it's Elohim's throne, theirs. And the Old Syriac has, which is Eloah or Allah's, their throne. Now, the word order is different, but in both cases, a plural pronoun has been inserted here to indicate that it's their throne, which is, of course, not grammatically what we would expect. I have a note here in the handout about how sometimes there are some places where plural pronouns and verbs and adjectives are matched with Elohim in the Tanakh. There's a list of some of those if you want to look at them in the handouts. But in the interest of time, we're going to move forward because we don't want to go on forever lengthwise. Okay, our next handout is titled Two Scribal Errors Ironically Preserve the Original Reading. I mean, that's really ironic that you would have a situation where the original reading is apparent to us because of not one but two scribal errors. And that the two scribal errors involve DuTillet Hebrew Matthew and the Old Syriac Aramaic text of the 4th century. All right, so in Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, the King James Version, in agreement with the Greek, says, and his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people, etc., etc. I'll stop there. The DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew has this verse opening with the phrase, and his fame went forth to all the people. While the Munster Hebrew text has, and his fame went out to all Aram, all Syria. But the Hebrew word for Syria is Aram. So it says, and his fame went out to all Aram. I'm not going to get too much into the Shem Tov text in today's video. We'll do a whole video about Shem Tov in the future. But just this is a perfect example of where the corruption of the Shem Tov, very Latinized. It says, and his fame went out to all the land of Syria, and it has Syria literally transliterated into Hebrew. It's not, Syria is not the Hebrew, it's not the Hebrew word for Syria. It's the Greek Latin word for Syria transliterated into Hebrew letters, which we would not expect to see in original Hebrew of Matthew. But we're going to ignore Shem Tov because what we really want to look at is the difference between DuTillet and Munster. The DuTillet Hebrew version of Matthew says that his fame went forth to all the people, and the Hebrew word for people is ha'am. Ha is the definite article, the people, ha'am. So it says, and his fame went out to all ha'am. But the Munster Hebrew text says that his fame went out forth to all Aram. So apparently what is happening here, or what took place here, is that a scribe was taking verbal dictation, and in the verbal dictation, there arose a scribal error between the misunderstanding of whether he heard Ha'am, the people, or Aram, Syria. And this fact, by the way, tells us that the Shem Tov reading is wrong. Okay. So how do we know which direction the error went? Well, there's a beautiful answer to that. The answer lies in the reading of the Old Syriac Sinaitic Aramaic manuscript of Matthew. In this ancient Aramaic manuscript, the scribe omitted the phrase altogether. The phrase, "and his fame went out to all the people," or all Syria. Either reading, that whole phrase is omitted. Now, why is it omitted? It's omitted because of a scribal error, and it's a scribal error that we call, and I have it spelled out here, and this is something I read, but I don't pronounce ever really, but it's homoioteliuton, which literally means same ending. It's a scribal error that takes place when a scribe is copying a manuscript, and he's copying on along by eye, and he looks back up to the text to get the next piece of next line of text or next piece of text to copy. And as he looks up, it happens when a word occurs twice close together in the text, a few words apart. And so he looks back to about where he was in the text, and he looks for that word that he was where he was, and he picks up the wrong one. He picks up the second occurrence of that word instead of the first occurrence, and he omits the material in between. In this case, he skips from the end of verse 23, which said, "all sickness and manner among the people," at the end of verse 23. And then when he looked back up, he picked back up at the phrase "the people" in verse 24 and omitted the material in between, which tells us that the reading that appeared in the Old Syriac must have been "the people," Ha'am, and not Aram, Syria, as we read in the Münster text. So the DuTillet has the original reading, "the people." So it was Ha'am, not Aram, as we read. We read Aram in the Greek and in the Latin Vulgate. But we know from this happy coincidence of not one scribal error, but two scribal errors, that the original reading had to have been Ha'am. And this also then points to DuTillet as preserving the original reading, and especially in combination with the Shem Tov Hebrew text. All right, our next handout is titled Barabbas. There's an account found in all four Gospels that there was a prevailing Passover custom in Jerusalem that allowed Pilate, the governor of Judea, to commute one prisoner's death sentence by popular acclaim. This is found in all four of the Gospels. And according to all four accounts, Pilate put forward two individuals and let the crowd choose between two, Yeshua and Barabbas. There was even a Barabbas movie back in the 50s or 60s, epic film. However, in the commentary to Matthew by the 4th century church father Jerome, who was responsible for the Latin Vulgate, by the way, he makes an interesting comment speaking about Barabbas in his commentary to Matthew chapter 27, verse 16. He's writing in the 4th century. He says, quote, is interpreted in the so-called gospel according to the Hebrews as son of their teacher. It's been proposed by some authors that Jerome is saying that Barabbas, or Bar-Abba, was not really named Bar-Abba, son of a father, but Bar-Rabbon, son of their master. The problem is that when Jerome says there here, he's almost certainly just doing so to set himself apart, distinguish himself from the Jews, whose gospel this is that he's referring to. It's very unlikely that anyone would have given the name or title son of their master to their child or to even an adult in Israel in the Second Temple era. What it would have been was son of the master or son of a master, not son of their master. There is something that Jerome has parenthetically inserted himself to indicate that it's their master, not his. Okay. So the original, then, Hebrew, if we understand Jerome correctly here, would not have been Bar Abba, but Bar Rabbah. And so we would have had an error of diction again. Both the DuTillet and Hebrew manuscript, both the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript and the Münster Hebrew text of Matthew have in their accounts not Barabbas or Bar Abba, but get this, Bar Rabbah, exactly as Jerome tells us that we should expect to find in the original Hebrew of the gospel. All right, there is so much more I could tell you and will tell you in the future about the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. We'll also do some on the Münster Hebrew text, an intro on the DuTillet of the Münster Hebrew text of Matthew in the future. We'll do at least one video on the Shem Tov Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. We're going to do several more in the future on different elements of the DuTillet Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that I didn't have time to get into today. For example, its tendency to follow the Masoretic text when it quotes passages from the Tanakh rather than the Septuagint or some freehand text. But I want to go ahead and wrap up because we're already taking quite a bit of time here. I need to ask people to please donate. Our rent is due in 2 days, and we only have $100. And our rent's not the only bill that's going to be hitting us at the first of the month, but it's the most important and the biggest by far. And $100 is we are really in need of donations to keep us from having serious problems. So if you could possibly make a donation, we definitely need your help to cover the rent. Okay, you can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description or by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Also, please like this video. Please subscribe to our channel. Please click that notification bell so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. And let us know what you think of our videos in the comments. Participate in the discussions in the comments section. Share these videos with your friends on YouTube, Twitter, by email. Tape the URL to stray dogs. Do whatever you can to help us get these videos out to a broader audience. Until next time, shalom everybody.